Hello, eighth grade. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 11, Section 3 Unity and Sectionalism. So, as we go along, make sure that you keep up and get everything written down. And if you need to pause, don't feel afraid to hit the pause button if you need to. So, a Boston newspaper called The Years of James Monroe's Presidency the Era of Good Feelings. And it has a lot to do with the fact that political differences, for at least the moment, it kind of faded away. We weren't worried about Democratic Republicans and those people who were Federalists. We were all just kind of Team America. A man named Henry Clay, who you see pictured below, kind of in the middle there, was a representative from the state of Kentucky. He was a Democratic Republican. He was also Speaker of the House of Representatives, and he introduced what is known as the American System, which was a nationalist program designed to help the nation grow by introducing a protective tariff. And if you remember a while back, a tariff is like a fancy name for a tax. It's a type of tax that's going to help American businessmen, probably a little bit because of the fact that Americans would probably be less likely to buy a foreign-made good that was more expensive than an American good that might be reasonably priced. So this program also included some internal improvements and called for a national bank. So if you take a look at kind of the flow chart there, this protective tariff will get funding for transportation improvements that would lead to maybe roads and canals. These improvements would obviously, in the long run, probably help business. This would allow for industrialization to prosper and probably allow for business to grow. So all of this is a great idea. The charter for the First Bank of the United States had expired in 1811, and Congress had allowed it to kind of fade away. But because of some economic hardship, by 1816, the Democratic Republican majority in Congress had passed the charter for the Second Bank of the United States that was signed under President James Madison. When the First Bank of the United States closed, many states made risky investments by making too many loans, allowing for too much money to go into circulation. And as a result, this led to inflation, which nobody likes. The Second Bank of the United States restored some order to the money supply, and it eventually helped businesses grow. So that's a win-win for America. But, spoiler alert, the Second Bank of the United States will not last forever because these charters are only for a set period of time. And if you don't have people that are in support of that, they can disappear. Hence the future of the Second Bank of the United States. Anyway, the tariff of 1816 was passed by Congress to help protect American manufacturers from foreign competition by placing a high tax on imported goods. This is kind of like what we would call a protective tariff. Anyway, merchants paid the tariff on imported goods and simply added the cost of the tariff to their prices. So in other words, who's going to pay this? Consumers are going to pay it. So the tariff dispute led to growing sectionalism, the differences and the goals and the interest of different parts of the country. It turns out that people in the Deep South weren't really all that excited about some of these tariffs. So John C. Calhoun, who you see pictured, the first picture kind of on the bottom, kind of towards the middle, he was from South Carolina. He believed that the high tariffs actually raised prices of manufactured goods and protected unqualified businesses. Daniel Webster, who is kind of right here, he was from Massachusetts. He was a great orator, which basically means he was fabulous at giving speeches. He represented the North. Henry Clay, who you see there on the far right-hand side, he was from Kentucky. We mentioned a moment ago he was Speaker of the House at one point in time. He tried to bring these conflicting interests together through compromise. And sometimes when you compromise, you don't always get what you really want. So In the Supreme Court, we have a decision of McCulloch versus Maryland, 1819. The court ruled that the state of Maryland had no right to tax the Bank of the United States branch because it was a federal institution, preventing a state from having too much power basically over the national government. And so, in other words, a state cannot tax a federal institution. That's a no-go. And this kind of sets a lot of precedents when we talk about the relationship between states and the federal government. In 1819, the Missouri Territory asked Congress for admission as a new state. And there was a lot of questions about who was making up the state of Missouri, because a lot of the settlers who went to Missouri had come from Kentucky and Tennessee, which permitted slavery. And there was a great question about slavery expanding into the West. Northerners were concerned that the admission of Missouri would threaten the balance between slave and free states. And thus, we got to come up with a compromise to kind of make everybody happy about how we're going to allow states to come into the Union. Again, we're going to be dealing with the issue of slavery. And this is way before the Civil War. So, Henry Clay suggested the Missouri Compromise. This is in 1820, and it would allow for Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state, but we're going to enter a new state of Maine as a free state. And this is going to kind of balance slave and slavery, slave versus non-slavery, in the Union for a time. Okay, slavery would be banned in the rest of the Louisiana Territory north of the 36-degree north parallel. So if you look at the map kind of in the middle, what that basically means is the kind of the southern border of Missouri that kind of separates maybe Missouri from what would be Arkansas, the Arkansas Territory, at least on this map. Anything south of there could be a slave state, but anything north, with the exception of Missouri, would probably be a free state. Okay, so there's little exceptions to the rule here. Okay, that sounds great for the time being. The Convention of 1818 also set the northern boundary of the Louisiana Territory between the U.S. and Canada. And this is going to be at the 49th parallel. So if you look at the map on the right side, this is going to be basically where our northern border is today. So states like Minnesota, North Dakota, parts of Montana, maybe a little bit of Idaho, they're all going to have this as their boundary here. Anyway, this is going to create a secure border, but it's also a border that's going to be maintained without an armed force. So for the most part, people could kind of come and go. There isn't really a fence, or there wasn't at a time. Today, there really isn't a lot of security on that border between Canada and the United States, especially in kind of what we would call the prairie provinces of Canada, or maybe some of the northern Great Plains states. It is kind of an open border for the most part. President John Quincy Adams, he also negotiated the right for the United States to settle the Oregon Country from the British government. The U.S. government urged that West Florida was also included in the Louisiana Purchase, but in 1810 and 1812, the United States took parts of West Florida. Native Americans living in Spanish East Florida sometimes raided American settlements in the state of Georgia. And this is going to cause a little bit of friction. So, April 1818, General Andrew Jackson invaded Spanish East Florida to stop the Seminole Native Americans from raiding people who were living primarily in what would be Georgia. And Andrew Jackson seized control of the two Spanish forts at San Marcos and Pensacola, which are kind of in the panhandle region of Florida. So Spain did not want a war, so they agreed to a treaty. So we've got the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, and Spanish ceded Florida and gave up its claims to the Oregon Country in the Pacific Northwest. If you remember, there was a time that Spain had pretty much kind kind of had control of maybe the western part of the United States because of its explorers that kind of came into our country starting in the 1500s. Nevertheless, they're giving all of that up, and the United States agreed to Spanish control of Texas. But that, again, will not last forever. In 1810, Father Miguel Hidalgo led a rebellion in Mexico against Spanish rule. He called for equality and a redistribution of land. There were several what I would call like peninsulares who were very wealthy land-owning Spaniards. And the people who were more of a Native American or a Mestizo background really didn't have a lot of rights. And Hidalgo was really kind of working for them. The Spanish captured and eventually executed Hidalgo. But by 1821, Mexico had gained its independence from Spain and became its own nation. In 1823, President James Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine. The United States would not get involved in the internal affairs or wars of Europe. In other words, we are going to mind our own business, is really what the Monroe Doctrine is kind of telling the world at this point in time. It also would not interfere with any existing European colonies in the Americas. So if there was a colony, let's say, in the Caribbean that belonged to Great Britain, for example, like the Bahamas, we're going to leave that be. Or Spanish-held Cuba, we're not going to bother with it. Okay? But North and South America were not to be considered to be subjects for future colonization by any European power, because most of those countries had just received their independence or were in the process of trying to fight for it. Thank you very much.